Originally released under the codename 1DnD, the 2024 D&D core rulebooks have been the subject of much discussion, controversy, and anticipation since their announcement last year. Recently, I released a TikTok and YouTube short about why I feel the 2024 playtest hasn't really been a good playtest so far. And it's been the most disliked video I've created yet, which tells me that this is a topic worth diving deeper into. Hi, I'm John, and this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're looking at the 2024 D&D playtest so far, and deciding whether it's a good playtest or a mess. Let's get into it. For us to determine whether or not D&D 2024 has been a good playtest so far, first we have to understand the function of playtesting in the first place. From my research, the purpose of a playtest is to collect feedback about a game's proof of concept, bugs, understandability, balance, and any dominant strategies that emerge once given to players. The key word here is feedback. Now, this topic can go really deep if we start considering other mediums, like card games, board games, or video games. So for now, we'll narrow our focus specifically for tabletop role-playing games. Now, I can imagine that playtesting TTRPGs in particular can be difficult just because of their unique nature. Rather than having strict procedures of play that all participants are expected to follow, the rules of a TTRPG are ultimately arbitrated by a game master, who can use, ignore, adjust, or create rules on the fly to fit a situation. Because of this, if you're playing different TTRPGs with a consistent game master, there is the possibility that the feel of them can kind of start to blend together. There have been a few times I've tried other systems, and the same players I have say, it's just D&D but with these different dice. Because, all in all, the core experience is storytelling with some randomizing tool. So, for TTRPGs in particular, really what we're looking at are the different tools that individual systems give a game master in order to help generate the story. A great example is a game that I'm currently playtesting called Distal, which I'll link in the description below. One of the things I love about Distal's design are its backstory tables. 5th edition D&D has a similar procedure that players can use to generate backstories, but the way that the different information is organized and categorized in Distal actually stimulates the imagination in a greater way than the backgrounds of 5th edition. The items and equipment that are generated through Distal's background tables also have much greater mechanical significance than a lot of what you would get out of a D&D backstory. So, knowing that our focus is going to be on the different tools that a TTRPG system provides, what kind of feedback can we give to a team to help them strengthen their game? The most important of all of these is proof of concept. Is your game fun to play? Do the mechanics and story mesh together well? How exciting is it to succeed versus how devastating is it to fail? For a specific example on that last question, a few times I've been invited to play the Savage World system. Unlike D&D, where a critical success is a natural 20, the highest possible number rolled on a d20, Savage Worlds uses what's called exploding dice, meaning that if you roll the maximum number, you get to roll again and add the result. So if I'm rolling a d6 and I get a 6, I get to roll that d6 again. And dice can explode over and over again. So if you roll 3 6s in a row, you start with an 18 and then get to roll a 4th time. A fellow game master once told me that he was running Savage Worlds for a group of teenagers, and that there was more celebration and a greater energy of exploding dice than a more absolute critical success like you see in 5th edition. Likewise, early on in the 2024 D&D playtest, the rules glossary had this experimental rule, where if you rolled a natural 1 on a d20, you would gain heroic advantage, which is the new term for 5th edition's inspiration mechanic. Although it might still be a bummer to fail a roll, the blow was softened by giving you a resource that would allow you to more likely succeed on a future roll. And of course, if you get a natural 1 on a check or something that ends up being inconsequential, well, now you have an asset to gain advantage on a roll that might matter much, much more. This is also why play testing, actually playing out the mechanics, is so important. Because for some tables, having that natural 1 failure softened makes checks feel less meaningful. A lot of DMs that I saw on forums and on YouTube were reporting that a potential problem was that players may end up making inane checks in order to try to trigger as many nat 1s as possible so that they could stack up their heroic advantage for when it came to things like combat. Some groups are going to want failure to feel more devastating. It'll help make the successes feel more exciting. Other groups want a more even experience, where yes, nat 20s are awesome, but nat 1s don't spell doom for their character. This is why feedback is so important. Depending on the game you're playtesting, the more that you playtest and experience it, the clearer you can understand the audience that the game was designed for. Of course, another simpler thing we can start to figure out how to identify through playtesting are any bugs. Now, in video games, bugs usually have to do with the game's programming. For example, your character falls through a floor that should have been loaded and should have been solid. However, bugs can happen in TTRPGs as well. If 2 rules specifically conflict with each other, it can potentially obstruct the flow of gameplay. We actually have an example of that in the 2024 D&D playtest. In packet number 6, the Bard had spellcasting that utilized the universal spell lists. However, almost immediately after the release of that packet, the D&D YouTube channel released an interview between Todd Kenrick and game architect Jeremy Crawford, where Jeremy Crawford explained that they were rolling back the universal spell lists for class spell lists. And as many people noticed, following that announcement and even in the next packet, there were no clear instructions of what to do with the Bard, now that the context of the rules had shifted. Some, including Treant Monk, interpreted this as, we can't play the Bard now, it's a bugged class. Even if a TTRPG's rule sets doesn't have any bugs though, we can still ask, is it easy to understand? 5th edition, as it stands now, is riddled with these obtuse rules interactions that aren't intuitive for your average player. It's why content creators like Treant Monk and Pack Tactics have such a large following. They do a great job of breaking down these rules interactions in an understandable way, even though I'm sure even they would admit that this specific service seems kind of unnecessary if the game was written in a more understandable way. A great example experienced by a fellow DM are the rules revolving around a player character at 0 hit points taking additional damage. If a player character falls to 0 hit points, they fall unconscious and begin making death saving throws on their turn. If they take any damage while at 0 hit points, they immediately suffer a death saving throw failure. If that damage is from a critical hit, they take 2 failures instead. All of these rules are laid out on page 197 of the player's handbook. However, in Appendix A on page 292, under the unconscious condition, it clarifies that any creature that hits an unconscious target within 5 feet of them automatically scores a critical hit. So you're expected to put 2 and 2 together and know that hits within 5 feet of your unconscious player character automatically count as criticals, and you're bubbling in 2 death saving throw failures. This isn't a bug, as in the rules aren't directly conflicting with each other, but it is easily missed, and arguably the information is poorly organized. Rather, it'd be very helpful on page 197, where most of these death saving throw rules are, to just gently remind players and DMs that this bullet point of the unconscious condition means that these kind of attacks are automatically critical hits. And of course, the last kind of feedback we can give has to do with game balance and dominant strategies. Game balance really has to do with how powerful an option is. Questions that we tend to ask with game balance are, is this option so good that it's devaluing other options? Is this option more reliable, or does it have a higher risk with maybe a higher reward? Are there ways that this option can combine with others to create some really big effect? This ties into our assessment of dominant strategies. But dominant strategies also considers how players perceive and understand the rules of the game. For example, in the Packet 8 interview between Todd Kenrick and Jeremy Crawford was mentioning that Brutal Critical was seen as kind of an extension of Reckless Attack, and how using Reckless Attack would increase the chances of scoring a critical hit, hence allowing Brutal Critical to trigger more often. The way he was talking about it, though, was as if this was a viable strategy, whereas many math analysts of the game, Treant Monk and Pack Tactics, have long shown through evidence and calculations that the benefit of Brutal Critical is not worth the cost of having attacks against you granted advantage. But again, it does start to inform certain design trends we've seen, like how the Ranger's base class is designed around Hunter's Mark, or the Warlock having this emphasis on using Hex, because even if this is not the most powerful strategy, it is a common strategy used by a lot of players that the design team is trying to support. Overall, these are just some of the different kinds of feedback that we as playtesters can give to a design team. And so, while we're assessing, is 2024 a good playtest, we have to consider, is this the kind of feedback that the design team is collecting and also implementing? One last thing I want to say on this is that what we're seeing is an open playtest. Jeremy Crawford has mentioned multiple times that this version of the game is also being playtested in a closed playtest environment, and that oftentimes the packet material that we get in the open playtest has already been filtered by the design team. Again, this is why actual playtesting is so vital. If we consider that the playtest packet 6 Monk was already somewhat approved by the design team, actual experience of other players and shifts in expectations at the table or gameplay assumptions can reveal flaws in the design that can be addressed. Now, looking at the past year and a half, it would be disingenuous of me to say that the design team hasn't done a lot of things well throughout this process. To circle back to how they collect feedback, the design team's surveys, I feel anyway, are well written and reflect a lot of the qualities that I laid out earlier. The satisfaction scores allows us to say whether or not we liked a specific mechanic's proof of concept. The comment boxes allow us to address any bugs, any wording or understandability issues, and of course, balance and dominant strategies. Then, after that survey data is processed, we've consistently gotten follow-up videos where Jeremy Crawford goes through the survey data and talks about how the team is interpreting that data, how it plans to move forward, and a lot of the intent behind their design. Now, some people do have an issue with what gets communicated. For example, we really only get specific statistics when a certain option does particularly well. If an option does poorly, like the Playtest 6 Monk, all we're told is, it needs some work. But we also see how our feedback has directly shaped future releases. The Monk is a really good example of this. For a while, I've seen a suggestion for a level 20 Monk ability to be designed along the same lines as the Barbarian's Primal Champion. And that's what we got in the Packet 8 release. In terms of whether or not they implement the feedback they receive, I'd say it's evident that they are listening, even if some of the changes aren't as extreme as some playtesters would like. One other thing I do want to point out is that this is not a playtest of a new game. The design team has had a decade of collecting feedback in order to understand 5th edition's specific pain points. 5th edition's overall proof of concept has been tested and has largely been successful. it's one of the reasons that, whether you like it or not, D&D is the most popular TTRPG in the industry. Now that being said, despite how well survey results have been communicated after they've been processed, and despite the fact that this game has really been play tested for about a decade, I still think that the 2024 core rulebook playtest is a faulty play test. And it comes down to two factors: how much content we're expected to playtest versus how much time we have to playtest it before being expected to give survey feedback. I would say that the most successful packet was actually Packet 1, Character Origins. We didn't get too much new content. We had some new ideas, but overall what we were playtesting were kind of tweaks to an existing system. The species and background feats could really be seen at different levels. You could play 3rd level characters or 5th level characters and still see what the value of all the options were. In that 3-week time span, I was able to get 2 or 3 different sessions in order to get actual play experience with the content that was released. Then problems started appearing even as early as Packet 2. Packet 2, which was expert classes, introduced this new categorization of the different classes. We were told that all of the classes would be grouped into 4 broad categories: experts, warriors, priests, and mages. And that not only were there common thematics in a class group, but there were also some unifying mechanics, and it would be an easy tool for us as players to make sure we had a diverse party. However, all of the classes that we got were in the same class group. They all fulfilled a similar function in a party composition. So how are we supposed to playtest it? Are we supposed to engineer a scenario where all of the player characters are using expert classes? Are we supposed to have multiple sessions where we have a balanced party using some classes from 5th edition, but only one expert class per party member? It doesn't feel very fair to have only one player character allowed to test new material. Also, by getting 3 classes, how are we expected to be able to playtest these classes at various levels? How much real hands-on experience could we get inside of 3 weeks? To be honest, the answer was not a lot. My circle of D&D players are very invested in this hobby, but even we could only get very limited hands-on experience before being asked for our feedback. Of course, in Packet 5, this gets real exacerbated. We have 5 classes to playtest, and between Packets 6 and 7, we now have dozens of subclasses, again across 20 levels of play. It is incredibly improbable that Wizards of the Coast was able to collect any meaningful amount of feedback from playtesters that actually got to playtest their content. Now, do I think that D&D 2024 is going to be a superior version to 2014? Yes, I absolutely do. Do I think that the Unearthed Arcana process helped contribute to that? Yes, I absolutely do. But it's not because it was a play test. More, it feels kind of like when we got the first live-action Sonic trailer, and we got that horrifying abomination of a Sonic model, and then the internet just kind of shouted at the company until they made the fixes we want. That's what this feels like. Wizards of the Coast releases a packet, everybody just shouts in the surveys, and then Wizards kind of finds a happy middle to try to make as many people happy as they can. It's not a playtest. They're getting feedback, but I don't think it's feedback from experience. However, in videos like this, I don't like to just complain. So here are some solutions. Especially if you're creating your own system that might even be built off of 5th edition or 5th edition adjacent. First, as a playtest, this process would have been much more effective if we were told what the packet content would be ahead of time. Packet 8 was an unannounced drop on a random Monday morning, and us as content creators had to scramble to try to figure out, analyze, and create content like this for you to view. In terms of content, it would have been much more helpful, rather than releasing one class group at a time, to instead release classes that would mesh well with each other, so that no matter how your group was playtesting, we could start to see the synergy between classes rather than either viewing them in isolation or in engineered scenarios that a lot of tables aren't going to be using. For example, for Packet 2, instead of releasing expert classes, I think it would have been a lot better to release, say, Fighter, Rogue, Cleric, Wizard, the more iconic classes that tend to be a little bit more generalized to begin with. Also, rather than telling us to test bastions in our current ongoing campaign, just completely stop the story and squish this random playtest material in there. Alongside the player options, release like a sample adventure. Give us encounters that are meant to accentuate the things that you've changed in the rules glossary, or new ideas that you think would be cool to explore in the classes. For example, in Packet 8, the real meaty changes to the Barbarian happen at 9th or 13th level. So give us like a cool 13th level adventure that can be completed in an hour or an hour and a half that highlights the changes you made to the class. Of course, the reason we're not getting these things is because it's likely that the goal of this wasn't a playtest to begin with. To defend the design team, they have a super strict deadline, and especially with the OGL debacle at the beginning of the year, they just have so many unreasonable pressures that they have to live up to. So, although I do believe objectively this is not a strong playtest, and Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro as companies, every testimonial I've heard about the actual members of the design team speaks very highly of them. And I do think that this was the best that we could get out of a huge mess. So, when you fill out the Packet 8 survey, remember to be kind in your comments. Be critical, be constructive, but remember that the design team has a lot of outside pressures, and they're still doing their best to do right by us as a community. So now I want to hear what all of you have to say. What do you think of the D&D 2024 core rulebook playtest? Were you able to actually playtest any of this material? Or, like me, have you been mostly giving impressions and gut reactions? Let us know in the comments down below. Hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.